Governance of official corporate policies is an important topic in today's business world, especially when one considers the rapid evolution of business practices, the effect of constantly changing legislation, and proactive risk management that goes along with having a well established corporate policy governance model. When you consider these requirements, along with the importance of ensuring that corporate policies are properly reviewed, approved, and audited, it makes sense to automate corporate policy approval processes, and this is exactly what this application is intending to do. Consider your own organization's policies when you build this application out. Perhaps these include policies tied to social media usage on company assets, expense claims, acceptable use, and so on. At the high level, we will set up a simple corporate policy approval application with the intent to help employees easily find policies and even contribute to the process of managing them over time. The application will allow any user in the organization to submit a new or updated policy for approval. If that policy is approved, it will be moved to a central library of official corporate policies, and a global notification will be sent out so that everyone in the organization knows about the new policy and has easy access to the latest official version. The application will also allow users to request that certain policies be withdrawn when they are no longer relevant. These types of requests will also be run through an approval process before the policy is withdrawn. Let's begin with the design of this solution by breaking it down into the elements that generally make up a K2 application: workflows, forms, reports, and data. We will use two different workflows for this particular scenario: a corporate policy submission workflow and a corporate policy withdrawal workflow. These workflows will provide the capability for any user in our organization to submit new policies for approval and eventually publishing, as well as allowing any user to request that an existing published policy be withdrawn. Let's look at the workflows themselves in a little more detail. The corporate policy submission workflow will allow any user to submit a policy for approval. The first workflow step in that process will update the document's status property to reflect that it was submitted for approval and is pending review. The next step will be delivered in the form of a user task to the members of an assigned document reviewers group. One of these users can open the document and determine whether it needs rework or can be moved on to a higher approval. If the document requires rework, the system will again update the document status property to reflect this, and then deliver a task to the workflow originator to either rework or cancel the policy submission. If they choose to cancel the submission, the system will update the document status to reflect that it was canceled, and the workflow will end. If they choose to resubmit the document for review, the status is updated accordingly and will circle back to the review policy task. This rework loop can be executed as many times as is necessary until the originator cancels the request or the reviewer sends the document for approval. When the document is sent for approval, the system will update the document status to reflect this and then assign the approved new policy user task to the approver for the current policy type. The interesting thing here is the approver will be looked up from a list in SharePoint so that the approval task is routed correctly based on the type of policy being submitted. At this stage, the approver may return the document for rework, in which case the same rework loop as before gets kicked off all over again. If the approver rejects the document, the system will update the document's status property accordingly and notify the originator. If the assigned approver approves the document, the system will move the submitted policy to the official corporate policies library, notify the originator of the workflow, and then send out a global notification to let users in the organization know that a new corporate policy has been published. Now we can bring in the requirement for our second workflow called corporate policy withdrawal. Once a policy has been approved and published in the official corporate policies library, any user can request for a policy to be withdrawn. The first step for these requests will prompt the system to set the policy status to indicate that a withdrawal request is pending. As before, the system will use the policy type to determine which user or users needs to approve the withdrawal request. If this user denies the request, the system will just revert the approval status of the policy back to approved and notify the requester that their request to withdraw the policy was denied. If the approver accepts the withdrawal request, the system will delete the policy document from the corporate policies library and send an email notification to the originator of the request. These two workflows make up the bulk of our corporate policy management application. Of course, you may want to take time to design these workflows with additional steps as they apply to your organization. But once you've built out the workflows, you can always go back and add additional steps or reconfigure existing steps as needed. Our recommendation is that you build out the application as prescribed in this guide to get it to a working state and get familiar with the setup before you change anything further. For this workflow design to be effective, we also need forms to capture data. To set this up, we will use K2 generated forms for the user interaction steps in the corporate policy submission workflow. Note that the generated K2 Smart Form forms are not going to be used to start the workflow. Instead, the user will manually initiate the workflows anytime that they like. We are using K2 Smart Forms, though, so that you can change the layout of the form that is used to edit and view the document's properties if you like. We will not actually make any changes to the generated form as part of this build guide, but in the interest of future-proofing your application and making it possible to modify the user interfaces at a later point in time, it's always a good idea to use K2 generated forms from the start for a K2 application. For the corporate policy withdrawal workflow, we will just use the standard SharePoint forms since there is very little actual user interface requirements in this workflow. It is essentially a one-step approval process that could equally well be completed using email. Let's take a moment to talk about the data sources driving this application that will include a SharePoint list, 2 document libraries, and a SharePoint permissions group. The first library is the Corporate Policy Submissions Library, which is used like a staging area for policies that are being edited, reviewed, or approved. Keep in mind, for our application, any user can submit a policy for approval. When a user submits their policy, they will need to select the policy type from a drop-down list so that the policy can be routed to the correct approvers. If and when the policy is approved, the workflow will move the document from this library into another library named Official Corporate Policies Library. We'll take a more in-depth look at these libraries when we build them out here in a few minutes. Along with the libraries, this application will use one SharePoint list to store and maintain the approvers for each type of policy. For example, HR policies will be approved by Cody, while finance policies will be approved by Bob and Anthony. This list will be used as a lookup in the Corporate Policy Submissions Library when users submit new policies for approval so that the policy can be routed by that workflow to the appropriate approvers for that type of policy. If multiple users are set as the approvers for a policy, both of those users will need to approve the new policy before it can become official. Now, the last element tied to our data design in this application will be a SharePoint permissions group used for the initial policy review task. We don't want to flood the final policy approvers with invalid or incomplete policies, so the members of this group act as the gatekeepers for any new policy submissions. Feel free to choose your own users for this review group in your environment, but normally this task is performed by members of your human resources or legal teams. In our application, the K2 workflow will just assign the policy review task to the managed members of this group. This approach allows the SharePoint site owner to modify the members of the group at any time without having to make any changes to the K2 application elements. We only need to require one person in this particular group to review the submitted policy, and they can send it back for rework or accept the policy, after which it will move on to the approval step. Let's do a quick preview of the steps we will take before we begin building our application. In step 1, we will add the K2 for SharePoint app to our site and configure it according to our needs. We will also add the K2 Worklist app part to the landing page of our site so users can work on their tasks. In step 2, we will set up our data sources with a host of steps to create lists, libraries, and SharePoint groups necessary for our application to run. We will use step 3 to create the K2 application elements for the official corporate policies library, thus exposing it to K2 for use in workflows and reports. Upon the completion of step 3, we will drop into step 4, where we will create the corporate policy withdrawal workflow. There will be multiple tasks in this step related to configuring all the workflow steps required to withdraw a corporate policy from the system. Step 5 will take us to the place where we will create the K2 application elements for the corporate policy submission library, allowing it to also be used in K2 workflows. And similar to step 4, we will drop into step 6 to add workflow steps to the corporate policy submission workflow, and then ultimately deploy it. Upon completing that, we will use step 7 to test the corporate policy submission workflow, and step 8 will round out our test for the corporate policy withdrawal workflow. The first thing that you need to do when building a K2 application is add the K2 app to your SharePoint site and then configure it. In step 1, we will perform this task as well as add the K2 worklist app part to the landing page of the site so that users can see their list of K2 tasks. When you want to create a K2 app with a SharePoint list or library, one of the first things you may need to do is add the K2 for SharePoint app to your site and optionally configure the app parts on one of your web part pages. This step may have already been performed on your site, so if that is the case, you can skip ahead to the next step. Keep in mind that if you have created a subsite and want to build K2 apps within it, you'll need to follow these steps to add the K2 for SharePoint app. In your SharePoint site, let's go into Add Lists, Libraries, and Other Apps to see what's available for this site. In this step, we want to add the K2 for SharePoint app to our site. So go ahead and select that option under the Apps You Can Add grouping. Now you should get a dialog box that pops up asking you to trust K2 for SharePoint. Since we know this is a trustworthy app, go ahead and click Trust It to begin the install. From here, you'll be directed back to your site contents page for this site. However, it may take a few seconds for the application to be completely added, so I'll pause the video and we'll come back once it completes. Okay, that's finished. We have one more step to complete before we can start building workflows, which is to configure the K2 for SharePoint app on this site. To get that moving, let's open the K2 for SharePoint application by clicking on it here. The first time you open this, it will take you through the registration wizard. On the first page, you'll need to confirm the SmartForms runtime URL is correct. For this demo, I can leave this set to the default URL and move on. However, keep in mind, your URL will be different if you're working inside your own environment. Just click on Next, and on the next window, K2 will take care of the configuration settings for you automatically. This will take a few seconds to complete, so I'll pause the video here. Okay, now that the configuration is complete, you ought to be able to validate that it worked by looking at all the green check marks next to each configuration section. It all looks pretty good here, so I'll go ahead and click Finish to move on to the next page. And that's pretty much it for the basic setup of K2 for SharePoint, so click on the name of your site to get back to the top. And also keep in mind that your site's name may be a bit different than mine as we work through this training together. So there will be a point where you're going to ask, how do my users open tasks that are assigned to them? Let's address that question now by adding the K2 Worklist app part to the landing page of our site. In order to do this, we'll edit the site landing page and then go to the Insert tab to find the App Part button from the ribbon menu. When you click on this, it will open up a list of app parts available to insert on the page. From here, select the K2 Worklist app part from the parts list, and then select the section of the page you want it to land on. In this case, all we get is rich content from the dropdown, so I'll leave it at that and click Add to get the worklist visible on the site. Then to save this change back to SharePoint, click the Save button either to the left of the ribbon menu or in the upper right just above the ribbon menu. And once that saves and opens the page back up in display mode, you'll notice we have the K2 Worklist app part ready to go on the page. That's the end of step 1, so let's take a moment to consider what we just did. Note that the K2 for SharePoint app has only been installed for the current site, so if you want to use it in other SharePoint sites, even subsites under this one, you'll need to repeat these same steps to enable the K2 for SharePoint app in those sites. We added the K2 Worklist app part to this site so that users can open their K2 tasks from within this particular site. Adding the Worklist app part is optional. Your K2 application will still work just fine even if you do not add the Worklist app part to this site. However, you may want to consider centralizing the work list on another site within your organization, so that users have a common place they all go to open their tasks. For the whole of Step 2, we will create the necessary list, libraries, and the SharePoint group needed for this application. We will start with Step 2.1 and create the Corporate Policy Approvers list in SharePoint, then expose it as a Smart Object to K2, and finally add list items mapping policy types to approvers. To create the list from the landing page of your SharePoint site, you can click on Add Lists, Libraries, and Other Apps if it's visible, or use the Settings menu in the upper right of the page and select Add an App. We want to set this up as a custom list, so once that page opens up for you, select the Custom List app and give it the name of Corporate Policy Approvers. We need to add a column to this list that will contain approver names from our organization. So go up to the Settings options for this list under the List menu tab at the top of the page in order to get to the Columns Management area. Once the List Settings page has opened, under the Columns section, select Create a New Column, then name it Approvers. You can make it a person or group column type, and then we want to require that it contains information by selecting Yes here. Enforcement of unique values can also be set to No. Allow it to have multiple selections, we want that. Ensure that it's set to allow selection of people only. All the rest of the default settings are okay at this point, so leave them alone, and then save that back to SharePoint when you're ready. Then we can move on to make a quick change to the title column. Let's open the settings for the title column now, and enable the option to enforce unique values. Click OK on the message that asks if you want to index the column. Since we will be using this column to list the various types of policies, for example HR, finance, or operations, and this list will be used to look up the approvers for those policies, we want to be sure that the title column is always unique. We do not want to have duplicate list items with the same title, like HR, with different approvers, for example. Now that our columns are set up, let's return to the content view of the new Corporate Policy Approvers list, and we can start adding the various policy types and approvers associated with those types to the list. I'm basically going to add the following values on my screen here to this list. Feel free to set up your own values here if you're building this out in your own environment. If you like, add a policy type called Test and use your own account as the approver so that you can test the application as yourself. Remember, you can also go back and add more types or modify the approvers later on. I'll pause the video here while I populate the list with the rest of the values. Okay, one quick reminder. You can enter multiple approvers for each policy type if that is appropriate for your organization. We are going to configure the workflow so that if multiple approvers are entered for a given policy type, each of those approvers will need to approve the document before it can move on. If you prefer in your own environment, it is easy to modify the workflow so that you can enter multiple approvers but only need one approver to accept the document. The next task we need to perform is to expose this list as a smart object so that it can be used by K2 in workflows that we will build later on. Open the List tab ribbon menu at the top of the page, and then select the Application button in the K2 group of options. On the Create K2 Application page, select the option to allow this smart object to be used in workflows for this site and all of its subsites, and then click OK at the bottom of the screen when you're ready. Just for clarification here, there is no need to create forms, workflows, or reports for this list, since it is only going to be used to look up values. But we do need to tell K2 that we want to use this list smart object from workflows and other document libraries. Now this may take a few seconds to complete, so I'll pause the video here for a moment. Okay, once redirected to the K2 Application Elements page for the list, click on the site link to return to the landing page for your site, and that will complete Step 2.1. To quickly review, we've now created the list that will be used to determine who will approve policies of a particular type for our organization, and we expose this list as a smart object which will allow workflows to read values from the list and assign user tasks accordingly. We need to create the landing library where the corporate policy approval workflow will move approved documents. We will use step 2.2 to create the official corporate policies library. Beginning from the landing page in your SharePoint site, click on Add Lists, Libraries, and Other Apps, or once again use the Add an App option from the Settings menu at the upper right of your page. This time select the Document Library app, and when the dialog window pops up, you can name the new library Official Corporate Policies, and then save it back to SharePoint. Once you drop onto the new Document Library page, open up the settings for the new library from the Library Ribbon menu tab at the top of the page. Now, for the sake of time, I'll do a quick run-through of each column as it should be created in the video here, and pop up the pre-configured setup window for each one. You can pause the video on each column if you'd like to match up with my settings as I run through them. So to begin creating columns, select the Create New Column option, and for the description, set multiple lines of text as the type, and then you can leave all the other settings to their defaults. This column is going to contain a short overview of the policy. For policy type, leave it set to single line of text, and nothing else needs to be changed on this page. This field is basically going to be the type of policy that the document is, and it's going to be populated by the workflow automatically once the document's approved. For approval date, you can set it to date and time, as well as having it be a date-only type column. The workflow will also set this column with the current date when the document is approved. Policy status will also be a single line of text column. The workflow will use this column and mark it approved when a new policy document drops into this library. However, the policy withdrawal workflow will actually update this field with a withdrawal request pending message while that process is running. Finally, add approval history as a single line of text. This column will contain a link to the approval workflow history for the related document, as you will see when we test out the approval workflow. We have one more column that we need to add, but before doing that, let's enable versioning for this library. You can open the versioning settings and then enable major versions for this particular library. We want to do this mainly in the case where an existing policy gets updated. If one actually does get updated, we will have a clear history of the various versions of this policy document over time. Now, for that last column we have to add, back on the library settings page, under the Columns section, click the Add from Existing Site Columns link, and then locate and add the version column to the library. Finally, click OK when you're ready. With that being the final column to add, your library should contain the columns that you see here on my screen. To set up for the next step, use the site name link at the top of the page again to return to the landing page of your SharePoint site. As this step is now complete, we have created the document library that will hold the official, approved policy documents and configured the library to keep version history for each of them. In a later step of this build guide, we will create a K2 application for this library. But before we do that, we need to create the Corporate Policy Submissions library, which is where the next step comes into play. In step 2.3, we will work through the tasks to create the Corporate Policy Submissions library. If you stayed with me after completing step 2.2, from the landing page on your SharePoint site, click on Add Lists, Libraries, and Other Apps, or open the Add an App page from the Settings menu at the top right of the page. Select the Document Library app again from this page and go ahead and name it Corporate Policy Submissions. Once this library is created, open the Context menu for the Corporate Policy Submissions library and select the Settings option. We only need to add 3 columns to this library, so under the Columns section, select the Create Column link to create additional columns for this library. I'm going to do an abbreviated run-through of each column in this library as well. Remember, you can pause the video on each field view if you'd like to match up with my settings as I run through them. For the description column, set multiple lines of text as the type, and then set require that this column contains information to yes, and leave all the other settings to their defaults. This column will also allow the user to add in a short overview of the policy. Policy type is going to be a lookup column from information already on this site. You'll need to set it to pull information from the Corporate Policy Approvers list and use the title column. Also, do not allow multiple values here and require that this column contains information to yes. This will contain the type of policy, be it human resources, finance, and so on. The workflow will key off this value to look up the appropriate policy approver tied to the matching list item in the corporate policy approvers list, as you'll get to see here in a few minutes. Finally, add policy status to the list as seen here. It will be a single line of text with all other options left to their default settings. This column will be updated by the corporate policy submission workflow as that workflow progresses. That's going to round out the settings for this library. So as a quick recap, in this step we created the library that users will use to submit new corporate policy documents. Think of this library as the working area for policies before they are submitted for approval and moved to the official corporate policies library. In step 2.4, we will create the Corporate Policy Reviewer SharePoint group that will be used to route the review policy task in the corporate policy submission workflow. Open the Site Settings from the menu at the top right of your page. This should be available from the landing page of your site as well if you happen to be there. Next, select the People and Groups link under Users and Permissions to drill down into the Management page for permissions. We want to actually add a SharePoint group here, so from the menu on the left, click on Groups. Then select the New button, drop down, and then select New Group. Let's call this new group Corporate Policy Reviewers, and then select Create. After doing that, we should see the new group containing at least the account used to log into the system. Let's add a couple users to this group so the workflow has users to send tasks. You can use your own values for the group based on your environment. However, in my example, I want to add John or Julie to review any submitted policies. I'll go ahead and leave the administrator in the group for testing purposes. Now that I'm done with that, I'll move back over to the landing page of the SharePoint site. In this step, we created a SharePoint group that will be used for the review policy task assignment in the corporate policy submission workflow. These users will need to review any submitted policies before they are submitted to the approver for the selected policy type. Now that all the SharePoint artifacts are created and configured, we can start to build the K2 application elements for this solution. In this step, we will be generating a new K2 application for the official corporate policies library. We'll begin with the corporate policy withdrawal application since the workflow for withdrawing an official policy document is a little easier. Open the K2 application settings for the official corporate policies library from the SharePoint site by selecting that library from the Quick Launch menu on the left. Once the library opens up, we can select the K2 application settings option from the Library tab ribbon menu at the top of the page. Upon entering this page, notice that the Data checkbox will already be selected. Make sure the option to allow this smart object to be used in workflows for this site and all its subsites is selected. We want to expose the library to all workflows for this site because we want to use this library in the corporate policy submission workflow as well, due to it being the landing place for approved policy documents originating from that library. We won't be allowing users to edit items in this particular library, therefore do not check the Forms option. With both workflows involved in this solution, we will basically only be allowing the K2 service account to add or delete documents from this library. Ensure that the workflow option is selected, and then configure it as follows. You can name it Corporate Policy Withdrawal Workflow, and keep in mind this is the name of the workflow as it will appear in the K2 Worklist app part and K2 reporting once you start running the application. The workflow will be manually started by a user if they want to request that a specific policy should be withdrawn. So we can set the start option based on the following event. You can put a check in the box for the setting Workflow is manually started. When you're done with that, select the option to create reports as I mentioned earlier, then click the OK button to create the K2 application. Because we selected the option to create a workflow, we will be dropped into the Workflow Designer when this completes. This may take a few seconds to complete, so I'll briefly pause the video. Okay, you should be sitting inside the Workflow Design tool at this point in time. Leave this screen open since we will build out the policy withdrawal workflow in the next step. As a quick review, in this step we created the K2 application elements for the official corporate policies library. In the next step, we will build out the corporate policy withdrawal workflow. Step 4 will consist of multiple tasks to add workflow steps to the corporate policy withdrawal workflow and ultimately deploy this workflow. Using step 4.1, let's start with the first server workflow step, which will update the document's policy status property within the SharePoint library. In the Workflow Design tool, select the Documents group in the ribbon menu at the top of the page, and then drag and drop the Update Document Properties step into the first blank step of the workflow as shown here. You need to select the document that you want to update when the Update Document Properties wizard appears. By default, K2 assumes you want to update the document that is associated with starting the workflow, which in this case is the official corporate policies reference already selected in the drop-down menu. This is what we want, so go ahead and click on Next to continue. On the Specify Values screen, enter Withdrawal Request Pending in the Policy Status text box. Then go ahead and click Finish. When this step fires, it will update this column with the entered text to indicate that the selected document has a withdrawal request. Let's take a moment to add clarity to what this step is doing on the design canvas. Let's double-click on the name of the new step we just added and rename it to Set Status Pending Withdrawal. Because we have an interest in adding more steps to this workflow, move your mouse over the new step and select the Outcomes icon that appears in the upper right corner. Next, click on the Add button and call the new outcome Continue, and then finish out the wizard. With that, we've completed step 4.1. Let's move on to the next step where we will add the user task for approving the document withdrawal. In step 4.2, we will add the user task called Approve Document Withdrawal Request. This will be a K2 task assigned to the owner of the policy type who will decide whether it is okay to remove the designated policy document from the published location. In the ribbon menu at the top of the page, switch to the General category and drag and drop a user task for SharePoint into the blank step that you just added in the previous step to the workflow. In this example, we won't actually use a form to let the user approve or deny the request. We will just attach the document to the email notification and let the approver reply to the email with their decision. However, we do need to select one of the available user task wizards to configure this step, so we'll just use the SharePoint option for now. Configure the first screen of the wizard as follows. Name it Approve Withdrawal Request. This is the name of the task as it will appear in the user's task list. For the instruction box, enter in Please review the official policy and decide whether or not the policy should be withdrawn. Remember, these instructions are shown on the task form when the users open it up. The user for this task won't necessarily have a link to the task form, but if you want to add it in for your organization, it will be available later on. For actions in this wizard, add in Approve Withdrawal and Deny Withdrawal. These will be the only two decisions approvers can make about the request when they receive their task. Now let's move on to the next screen where we will set the type of form for this task. On the user form screen, just select the Display option and then click Next. We don't want users to edit anything for the specific document if they happen to come to this form. But remember again, they will most likely be using email smart actions to action this task anyway. Next, on the Participants screen, we will use the approver tied to the current policy type of this document. To do so, we need to query the Corporate Policy Approvers list and send in the type of the current document as a query parameter, so that we can get back the approver for that policy type. For example, if this is an HR policy type, then the HR approver must approve the request. The document's policy type column contains HR, so we need to pass this value to the approver list to determine who the approver for HR policies happens to be. Switch over to the context browser on the right, expand the Smart Objects group, and then locate the Corporate Policy Approvers Smart Object. A quick note here to prevent one of those gotcha moments. You may see a smart object called Corporate Policy Approvers Attachment. This is not the smart object that we want to use here. Use the Corporate Policy Approvers smart object as it appears on my screen. Remember that when you created the list in SharePoint, you selected the option to allow the smart object for that list to be used in workflows for the site collection. This is why we had to select that option so that K2 applications and other lists could interact with the policy approver's SharePoint list. We will use this same smart object in the corporate policy approval workflow later on. Expand the corporate policy approver smart object and then locate and expand the Get List Item by Title method. Drag and drop the Approvers node from the context browser into the Task Groups section on the left. In the Approver dialog box, notice that the title value is required because this is what we need to locate the item in the Approver list via the Smart Object method. Now we can get this from the context browser by expanding the Item References node, then the Official Corporate Policies node, and then drag the policy type value over to the title text box. When you're done with that, click OK to close the Approver dialog box. One last thing on the Participants window. Select the option to notify participants when they receive a work item, since this will prompt us to configure the message settings on the next window. In the Event Notification Settings screen, select the option to customize the notification message. Then for the subject line, type the following: Corporate Policy Withdrawal Request, your approval needed. Then click on the down arrow next to the subject label. We want to attach the policy document to this email so that the approver can review the policy and decide whether or not it should be revoked without having to necessarily open up an entire form. In the context browser, expand the Item References node, then the Official Corporate Policies node, and drag and drop the document item into the Attachments field. Let's look at the body of the message next. In the message body, you can remove the sentence that provides the link to the work list item and the instruction to reply to the email. However, be sure not to delete the Configured Actions field because we want to list these options for the user. I'm going to add the following text to the email body, but feel free to add your own version of the message if you choose, or pause the video here for a second to copy in what I have on my screen. My statement will be, has requested that the official corporate policy should be withdrawn. The policy document is attached to this email. Please review the document and indicate whether the policy should be withdrawn or not by replying to the email with one of the following actions. Now I'll drag and drop the originator full name field from the workflow context group in the context browser over on the right, and I'll drop it into the email message and position it in the text as I entered here. I'll also drag and drop the document's title into the email body to at least give the user a little more information on the decision that they need to make. Once you've got that complete, you can click Finish to move on. Next, we will configure the outcomes for the approval task so that all approvers will be required to approve the document withdrawal request, or in the case of rejecting this request, one approver can make that decision. From your workflow design canvas, move the mouse over the Approve Withdrawal step, and then click on the Workflow Step Outcomes icon that appears in the upper right. Select the Approve Withdrawal outcome, and then click on the Edit button. In the Outcome Rules screen, change the drop-down menu so that all participants must select the Approve Withdrawal action, and then click OK. Let's quickly edit the Deny Withdrawal outcome to verify that it is configured so that one participant selects the withdrawal denied action. This looks good, so click OK to complete the outcome configuration for the approval step. Remember, if there is more than one approver for the policy type in the policy approvers list, we want all of those approvers to approve the withdrawal request. But if any one of the approvers rejects the withdrawal request, we want the reject path to be followed immediately without waiting for any other approver's input. As you've worked through this exercise up to this step, at this point your workflow should look like mine right here on the screen. Before we move on, let's save this workflow design so we don't lose any of our changes. You can do this by selecting File from the menu at the top left of the page, and then select Save from the menu to save your workflow back to K2. To briefly review this step, we added the user task for the approvers to decide whether or not the policy should be withdrawn from the official corporate policies library. To do this, we used the corporate policy approvers list to determine who should approve this request based on the policy type assigned to the document. We also attached a copy of this policy document to the email notification to provide more information to our users assigned to the task, thus enabling them to make a quicker decision without having to open up a form to do so. Finally, we configure the outcomes of the approval task so that if there are multiple approvers for the selected policy type, all those approvers will need to approve the policy withdrawal request before the workflow removes the document from the library. In step 4.3, we will implement the pieces involved with both the approved and deny paths of the withdrawal workflow. This will be comprised of a delete document step, an update document property step, and 2 send email workflow steps. Starting from the ribbon menu at the top of the page, switch to the Documents Group category on the left and drag the delete document step into the empty slot on the approved path of the workflow. We won't have to configure much of anything for this step because K2 will assume we are deleting the document associated with starting the workflow, which is correct at this point, so let's move on to set up the send email step for this path. Let's add a new outcome called Continue to the delete document step by hovering the mouse over it and selecting the workflow step outcomes icon that appears again in the upper right. Select Add and enter the word Continue for the new outcome, and then you can close this out when you're finished. Next, moving back to the General category in the ribbon menu at the top of the page, drop a Send Email step into the workflow for the new step we just added. Let's configure the email so that it is sent to the originator of the workflow by grabbing the Workflow Originator's email field from the Workflow context menu on the right side of the wizard. We're going to add some text to the subject line for this message. So on my instance, I'll enter in, "Your corporate policy withdrawal request has been approved." Then for the body of the message, I'll enter in, "Your request to withdraw the corporate policy has been approved and the document has been deleted from the official corporate policies library." Now make a note of this next item. Because the document was deleted in the previous step, we can't use the item reference in the context browser anymore for that document, but you can use the folio of the workflow in the subject line and email body as shown on my screen. By default, the folio value for the workflow will be set to the title of the item in SharePoint that was submitted to the workflow because we didn't change that at the beginning of this lesson. So go ahead and drop that field into the text of the email body from the workflow context group on the right, similar to my screen here. That's all we need to set up for our approved path to this workflow. Next, let's move on to implement the steps for the denied path. From the ribbon bar menu at the top of the page, switch to the Documents category and then drag and drop the Update Document Properties event into the blank step of the denied path on your design canvas. We can leave the reference value that is already selected in the document dropdown alone, which is Official Corporate Policies, so go ahead and click Next to move on. On the Specify Values window, enter in the word Approved for the Policy Status column, and then click Finish to complete this wizard. The reason for updating this property value is because we want to reset the policy status displayed to employees from Withdrawal Request Pending back to Approved if the request is denied. This will indicate to our employees that the policy is still approved. For clarity and ease of support, let's rename this step to Set Status Approved by double-clicking on the step name here and entering in the text. Then we can add our final new outcome the same way we did it in previous steps. Click on the Steps button here on the right, click Add, name it Continue, and then close out the window to generate the empty slot. Now let's go back up to the ribbon menu and switch back to the General category of wizards and grab the other Send Email step to drop it into the new step of this workflow path. We're going to configure this email so that it notifies the originator that their request was denied. Use the Workflow context group to drag the originator's email address into the To text box. You can use whatever text you like for the subject line and body of the email message, or you can pause the video and add in the text on my screen as it appears. For the subject, I'm going to enter in, "Your corporate policy withdrawal request has been denied." And then for the body of the message, I'll add the text, "Your request to withdraw the corporate policy has been denied." Now with the body, I'm going to also drop in the folio title from the workflow context into the message right here for clarity. Close that wizard out when you're ready, then quickly rename the email steps to be more representative of what each one is doing. I'm going to call the approval email step Send Approved Email, and then I'll call the denied email step Send Denied Email. Based on the steps we've completed up to this stage, your workflow should look something like mine when you get here. Now let's quickly recap step 4.3. In this step, you added the server steps for both the approved and denied paths of the workflow, which covered the abilities to send email notifications, delete a document from a document library, and update the properties of a document in a library. With step 4.4, we're going to deploy the corporate policy withdrawal workflow now that we have completed all the workflow steps it needs to operate. Let's take a moment to deploy this workflow now that it's ready to go. From the File menu at the top of your page, select the Deploy menu option that appears. The workflow will be validated at this point and will then be deployed to our K2 environment. This may take a bit of time to complete if this is the first time you're doing this in your system today. So at this point, I'll pause the video and come back when my workflow is deployed. Okay, when you see the success message, your workflow has been deployed to your system. We can select the Close and Exit button to go back to the K2 Application Elements screen for the official Corporate Policies library. And then to set up for the next phase of the build guide, go ahead and click on the site title at the top of your page to return to the landing page for your site. The next step will involve creating the K2 application elements for the Corporate Policy Submissions library. In step 5, you will create the K2 application elements for the Corporate Policy Submission K2 application, which is the other half of our workflow-driven solution. Beginning from the landing page in your SharePoint site, open the Corporate Policy Submissions library. Then open the K2 Application Settings from the Library tab menu at the top of the page. Once this page opens up, you'll notice that the data checkbox will already be selected for this library. But make sure that the option to allow this smart object to be used in workflows for this list or library is selected at this time. We will not need to use the library in other workflows for this site, so we can keep the smart object restricted for use in workflow for this library only. We're going to use K2 Smart Forms in this part of the demonstration, so put a check in the Forms option and configure it so that K2 Smart Forms are used for the new, edit, and display forms for the library. Also, select the Workflow option in the next area. Give it the name of Corporate Policy Submission Workflow, which again is the name of the workflow as it will appear in the K2 Work List app part and the reports. For the Start option, set it up for when the following events occur, then select Workflow as manually started. We can do this because we want the workflow to be manually started by a user when they are ready to submit the policy for approval and release. Lastly, enable the option to create reports, and then select the OK button to create the K2 application. This will take a few seconds to complete, so I'll pause the video for the sake of time. Okay, you should have dropped into the K2 Workflow Designer since we selected the option to create the workflow. Having added the K2 elements necessary for this part of the application, we are now ready to move on to the next step to build out the Corporate Policy Submission workflow, which is step 6. Step 6 will be broken down into smaller steps since we will be adding the various server and user tasks to the Corporate Policy Submission workflow and then deploying the workflow. For step 6.1, we will add the first workflow step to set the document's policy status after the workflow kicks off. In the Workflow Design tool, select the Documents group in the ribbon menu, and then drop the Update Document Properties step into the first blank step of the workflow. The Update Document Properties wizard will appear, and on the first page you need to select the document that you want to update. As before, K2 assumes you want to update the document that is associated with the workflow, so it sets the reference to the Corporate Policy Submissions Item Reference option by default. We can leave this as it is and click on Next to continue on to the Specify Values window. On the Specify Values screen, add the text Submitted for Review into the Policy Status text box, and then click Finish to complete the wizard. Before moving on to the next task, let's rename this part of the workflow design by double-clicking on the name of the new workflow step and rename it to Set Status Submitted for Review. Then we'll quickly add a new outcome to open up another workflow slot here. Do this by moving your mouse over this step and then click on the Outcomes icon that appears. Let's click the Add button and enter the word Continue for the outcome. You can close that out when you're done. From here, we can move on to the next step, which will incorporate one of the user tasks for this workflow design. As we walk through step 6.2, we will be adding and configuring the Review Policy user task to the workflow. Switch to the General category on the ribbon menu now, and then grab the user task for Smart Forms and drop it into the blank step that's available on the design canvas. Name this user step Review New Policy, and then add in the following for instructions. Please review the submitted policy and indicate whether it can be sent for approval or returned for rework. Once you get that in there, add two actions, one called Send for Approval and the other one called Return for Rework. The Return for Rework action will eventually lead us into building a rework loop for this workflow, which we'll get to here in a few minutes. On the next window, we will set up the user form we need to display to our users. Select the ellipses button to open up a tree view of available forms in K2, then drill down to the Corporate Policy Submissions library in the list if it's not already opened up there. Select the Display Document form, and then click OK. Our current requirement is to not allow the reviewers to change the document properties. Therefore, they should only be required to read the document and make their review decision. Rather than using a specific person to receive this task, we want to use the SharePoint group we created back in step 2.4 called Corporate Policy Reviewers. On the participant screen, change the search content in the Search tab to Group, and then search for Corporate Policy Reviewers. Once the group is located, drag it over to the Task Group section as shown on my screen here. Then be sure to enable the option Notify the participants when they receive a work item, and then click Next. On the Event Notification Settings screen, let's select the option to customize the notification message. And for the subject line, drop in the following: Corporate Policy Submitted for Review. Moving on to the body of the message, add a sentence that provides some context about the newly submitted policy. You can use the text as shown on my screen as a template, or use your own text if you prefer. I'll add this with a space at the beginning. Has submitted a new corporate policy titled with another space. Please review the policy using the link below and indicate whether or not the policy can be submitted for approval or requires rework. Then from the context browser, I'm going to drag and drop the originator's full name from the workflow context group into the email message in this spot. And then I'll grab the document's title and drop it into the email body as well. And I'll finish it up. So if you're caught up, your workflow should look something like mine on the screen. Let's do a quick recap. In this step, we added the user task for one member of the Corporate Policy Reviewers group to decide whether or not the policy should be submitted for approval or should be returned for rework. In the next step, we will implement the rework path of the workflow. To implement the rework path in step 6.3, we will be asking the originator to decide if they would like to resubmit the policy for review after they have made changes to it, or cancel it completely with a user task. We will also update the status of the policy accordingly. The first workflow step we'll add here is an Update Property step to change the status property of the corporate policy document. Switch the ribbon menu over to the Documents group of workflow wizards and drop the Update Document Property step into the Return for Rework path of the workflow. For this instance, we can use the default Corporate Policy Submissions document reference and set the policy status property to the text of Rework Required and complete the wizard. Next, let's rename it to Set Status Rework by double-clicking on the current name of the workflow step. And once you've completed that, add a new outcome called Continue. This will open up an empty space so we can drop in the user task for the workflow originator to decide if they want to fix the issue with the policy or cancel the request. Moving on now to configure the next user task, switch back to the General category on the ribbon menu, and then drop the user task for Smart Forms into the new step of the rework path. Start by naming this user task Rework or Cancel New Policy in the wizard window that pops up. For the user tasks instructions, I'm going to add in the following text: Please rework or cancel the policy you submitted for approval. And then the available user actions for this task will be Return for Review and Cancel Policy Submission. With these two options presented, the originator can either send the document back for another review after making changes to it, or cancel the policy submission if they decide they do not want to move it on at that point in time. Moving on to the next configuration option, on the user form screen, you can leave the Edit Document form selected. We will allow the user to edit the document properties before they resubmit the document for review. Now let's configure the participants for this user task next. On the Participants screen, drag the originator into the Task Groups section by grabbing it from the Favorites list in the context browser on the right side of the window, and then check the option to notify the participants when they receive a work item. We can customize the notification next and give the originator some context about the document that they need to rework. Feel free to add any text you would like for the subject and body of the message, or once again, pause the video and copy the text as I enter it in here. For the subject line, I'll add in New Policy Submission, Rework Required, and then for the body, I'll enter the new corporate policy titled, with a space, that you submitted for review has been returned for rework. Please rework the submitted policy and resubmit it for review, or alternatively, cancel the policy submission. Let's leave the work list item link in the email so that the user can actually open the task form for the task directly from the email this time. And real quickly, before moving on, I'm going to drop the document's title field from the item reference in the context browser so that the body of the message makes more sense when it gets sent out. I'll just drop it here in the space that I left in the body of the message. If you're following along with me, click Finish when you're ready to move on to adding the next Update Document Properties task. Now, after closing that out, using the ribbon menu, switch back to the Documents category, and then drop an Update Document Properties task into the Return for Review step of the workflow. We're now going to configure this step so that it sets the policy status for the Corporate Policy Submissions reference document to Resubmitted for Review. Then, once you've finished that wizard out, rename the step to a more descriptive title like Set Status Resubmitted by double-clicking on the name here. And once you're done with that, we'll add a new outcome so that the workflow will go back to the Review Policy task. This is going to be a bit different than adding a blank slot as we've done before. This time, open the Outcomes for the Set Status Resubmitted task, add a new outcome called Go to Review, and in the Link to drop-down list, configure the outcome so that it is linked to the Review New Policy step. Then click OK when you're done. By doing this, we will redirect the flow of the process back to the reviewers group so that they can take a look at this document once again. Go ahead and close that wizard out when you're ready. For the last blank step of the rework path in the workflow, use the Update Document Properties step and configure the step so that it sets the policy status for the Corporate Policy Submissions reference to Canceled. Again, we can get this workflow step from the Documents group in the ribbon menu at the top of the page. A quick hint for your environment, you could also delete the policy document with the Delete Document step if your requirements call for this in your organization. But for this scenario, we will just set the status to Canceled so that other users can see that the proposed policy was canceled during its review. Now, once you've configured that step, close it out and rename the new step to Set Status Canceled. And then quickly use the File menu at the top of the page to save your workflow back to the system. Your workflow should now look something like mine here when you're done. Notice that the rework path graphically depicts going back to the Review New Policy step of the workflow now. To quickly review this step, in this step, we implemented the rework path of the workflow where the originator may decide to resubmit the policy for review or cancel it completely. We used server tasks to keep the status of the document updated so that you can always see where the document is by looking at the document's status in the submissions library. In the next step, you will implement the approval path section of the workflow. The next order of business will be to implement the approval section of the workflow in step 6.4. In this stage of the process, the policy document will have already passed through the review process successfully and will need to be approved for release by the designated policy type owners. Get the Update Document Properties step from the Documents group on the ribbon menu and drop it into the empty slot on the Send for Approval path of the workflow. Let's configure this step to set the policy status property for the corporate policy submissions document reference to pending approval. Then click Finish when you're done. Take a moment to rename the step to Set Status Pending Approval, and then add a new outcome called Continue. Doing this will open up a slot for us on the canvas to drop the user task that will assign an approval task to the policy document type approver. Now, once you're done with that, switch to the General category on the ribbon menu and drag and drop a user task for Smart Forms into the new step of the approval path. And starting with this, name this task Approve New Policy. Add the following instructions if you'd like, or you can add something meaningful for your organization if necessary. My instructions on the task form will read, please review the proposed new policy and submit your decision about the proposed policy. This task will have 3 available actions for the assigned user, mainly approved, rejected, and return for rework. These are the decisions that the approver can make about this request. They may approve or reject the policy outright or return it for rework to the originator. And that's all we need for this screen, so let's move on to set up the form. In the User Forms screen, click on the ellipses button and then in the resulting tree view, select the Display Document form and then click OK when you're ready. We do not want the approver to be able to change the document properties at this stage of the process. They should only be able to read the document and make their review decision. Once you've set the Display Document form as the user form, you can go ahead and click Next. On the Participants screen, switch to the Context browser to expand the Item References group, then expand the Corporate Policy Approvers node. Drag and drop the Approver field into the Task Groups section on the left as I do it here. Now, because we configured the library in SharePoint to use the Approvers list as a lookup, the nice thing here is K2 automatically added a reference to the approver for the current policy type. Compare this back in step 4.2 where we had to use a smart object to query the approvers list because the official corporate policies library did not use a lookup column for policy type. Of course, we could have configured that library to use a lookup, but in this lesson we wanted to show you how to use both a smart object for task assignment and how to use a lookup column for task assignment. Before leaving the screen, select the option to notify participants when they receive a work item, and then click Next. Let's customize the notification message and change the subject line for the email to something like this. It should say, New Corporate Policy, with a space where we'll drop the title field, Submitted. Your approval required. I left the space for the title, so I'll pull that in from the Context browser and drop it in the subject line. We can drag that over from the item reference for the document and drop it in the middle of the text here. For this user task, let's also attach the proposed policy document to the email message so that the approver can open and review the document directly from the message. So click on the down arrow next to the subject line, then drag and drop the document field from the Context browser on the right into the attachments text box. You can see how I'm doing this right here on my screen. We can also change the body of the email message so that it reads something like this on my screen. Now at the beginning I'll leave a space for the originator's full name and it will read, has submitted a new corporate policy titled, with another space for the title. Please review the proposed policy attached to this email and then indicate your approval decision in one of the following ways. Now I'll drop the originator full name over from the Context browser, and then I'll also drop the title context field into these 2 spots in the message for more clarity. Then finish the wizard when you're ready. Keep in mind you can use your own text here if you prefer. Feel free to pause the video briefly if you want to do that. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next step. Next, we will configure the outcomes for the Approve New Policy task, so open the Outcomes for the Approval task by selecting the Workflow Step Outcomes button that appears when hovering over the workflow step. If you recall, we did this in our other workflow for this solution. Select and edit the approved outcome and configure it so that all approvers need to select the approved action. Click OK and we'll move to the Return for Rework Outcomes setting. Change the Return for Rework outcome so that it is linked to the Set Status Rework step. And then click OK when you're done. That's all we need to configure for the outcomes on this task. Now let's move on and work on the rejected path at this point. Drag an Update Document Property step into the rejected outcome and configure the step so that it sets the policy status column for the corporate policy submissions reference to rejected. And close that out when you're ready. Now let's take a quick moment to rename the step to Set Status Rejected, and then we can add a new outcome called Continue to the Set Status Rejected step. This will prep the workflow canvas for the task of adding a reject email notification back to the workflow originator. Great, with the newly added empty slot on the reject path, let's drag a Send Email step into this step from the ribbon menu. We want to configure this email notification so that it lets the originator know that their policy was rejected. I can do this by adding in a subject line that says something like, "Your policy titled," with a space, "has been rejected." And notice that I did include that space for values from the context browser again, so that the requester has some idea which proposed policy was rejected. I'll drop the policy title into the subject line. And then also, I'll add in a message to the body, so go ahead and make yours similar to mine. Mine will say, "Your proposed corporate policy titled has been rejected by the approver for the policy type." And with that, I'll drop the title into the blank spot here. And I'll also grab the policy type value option from the context browser and drop it here. That's it for the send email message, so I'll save it back to the system. And then before we move too far ahead, let's go ahead and rename this new step to Send Rejected Notification. With this workflow getting a bit large, let's take a moment to save it back to K2 to make sure we don't lose anything. So you can select File from the menu at the top, and then click Save. To quickly review, in this step we implemented the policy approval task, which will be routed to the designated approvers for the proposed policy based on the definitions we added to the corporate policy approvers list. Now it's time to move on to the next step, where we will add the tasks for the approved path of the workflow. As we get close to completing step 6, we will round out the workflow tasks by implementing the approved path of the workflow in step 6.5. For this part of the workflow path, the policy document will have already been approved by the policy type approvers. After this approval, we want to move it to the official corporate policies library in the workflow, so switch the top ribbon menu over to the Documents category, then drag the Move Document step into the empty slot on your workflow design canvas. On the Specify Document screen, leave the default setting as is by using the document reference called Corporate Policy Submissions, and then go ahead and click Next. Remember, this is the document associated with starting the workflow, which we now want to move to the official Corporate Policies library. From the Specify Destination screen, we want the current site collection where we're working selected in the Browse to Library option, which in my case will be the Portal Site Collection. Keep in mind, this list box may be set by default if you only have one site collection in your environment. One other thing before we move on here, make sure that the setting Overwrite Existing Document is selected, because if you recall, new versions of existing policies can be published through this workflow as well. Let's configure where this document will land on the Specify Destination Library screen next. You can browse to the destination library called Official Corporate Policies. Depending on your environment, you may have to select a subsite first if your official corporate policies library lives in a subsite. You'll notice this here in my environment that I need to select How to K2 since this is the subsite where my application libraries actually live. In moving on to the next step, we will need to map properties from the original document to properties on the target document. We'll take care of this on the Specify Properties screen. Drag and drop the title field from the Corporate Policy Submissions group under the Item References node into the title property as demonstrated on my screen here. Then you can pull the description field of the item reference into the description property, and also get the policy type value field and drop it into the policy type property for this document as well. Recall that the policy type value will actually be used back in the withdrawal policy workflow to get the assigned approvers for approval of withdrawal requests. Let's give some feedback to our audience from the workflow by using the policy status column. Enter the word approved in the text box to indicate the policy is actually approved. This will also indicate that the current document should be used by employees and isn't currently in a withdrawal pending status. Now for the approval date property. We're going to use the now inline function so that the approval date property is set to whatever the current date and time is when the document is approved. You can open the inline functions group from the context browser. Then go ahead and drill into the date and time list of functions and drag the now function over to the approval date property. That's all we need to do for this function. We can also provide some historical detail about the approval workflow for this policy document by adding a link to the K2 ViewFlow report. If policy owners or users want to know who approved the document and when, this report can provide that information when needed. So for the approval history column, drag and drop the ViewFlow field under the workflow context group in the context browser on the right, as I'll demonstrate here. Okay, and one last thing on this screen, ensure the Create Document Reference checkbox is checked and that the reference is named something like Official Corporate Policies, because we're going to need a reference to this document in its new location in future workflow steps. And go ahead and click Finish when you're done. Once you're back on the design canvas, quickly add a new outcome called Continue to the Move Document step, following the same processes that we've worked through in previous steps to do this. We'll use this empty slot to send an email notification to the workflow originator that their policy has actually been approved. Now we can add the email notification at this point, so go up to the General category in the ribbon bar and drag and drop a Send Email step into this new step in your workflow. Let's configure this particular message to notify the originator that their proposed policy was approved. Feel free to use whatever text you like for the subject and body, but it is a good idea to provide some context about the document in the email, as in our example here. For my subject line, I'll add in this text: Your proposed policy, has been approved. Then for the body of the message, I'll add in Your corporate policy titled, with a comma, has been approved and has been published in the, with a space there at the end. Make a note here, I'm going to drop the title into the subject of the message from the item reference called Official Corporate Policies from our previous step. Because remember, we just moved the original document to another library, so the original Corporate Policy Submissions item reference is no longer valid. I'm also going to drop this same title field into the body of the message. And one last thing about the body of this message. I also want to add a link to the email message for the user to easily browse to the Official Corporate Policies library. So take a moment to follow these next steps if you'd like. Start from your context browser, then drag and drop the hyperlink inline function into the email body. You can get this from the text group of inline functions. The next thing we want to do is open a new browser window into your portal and go into the Official Corporate Policies library. Right-click on the library's title link, and then copy the URL shortcut for your Official Corporate Policies library from the menu option that pops up. Let's go back to configure the inline functions URL property now with the link to the Official Corporate Policies library. For the URL's display name, you can go ahead and enter in Official Corporate Policies library, then paste the copied URL into the URL text box. Keep in mind your values may be a bit different than my values in your own environment. Go ahead and click OK when you're done with the URL wizard, and click OK to complete the Send Email step. Let's go ahead and rename this email step to Send Approval Notification by double-clicking on the title of the step here and then entering it in. And once you've completed that, let's also quickly add an outcome called Continue to the Send Approval Notification step. We want to add one more notification to a larger audience to make them aware of the new policy release. drag and drop a send email step into the new blank step in the workflow. Feel free to configure the email notification to send a message to whomever you want to notify about this new policy. You may want to plan this down to a more individualized list or set it up for a corporate-wide distribution. A hint about sending messages like this: be sure to include the title of the policy in the subject line so your users have more clarity about the mass communication. We want to use the title value from the official corporate policy item reference because the previous item references are no longer valid since the document was moved. I'll drag this into my subject line as shown here. Also, for my environment, I'm going to send the email to a distribution list called everyone@denalix.com. This will allow everyone in my organization to know about the new policy, but remember, you're free to use whatever distribution list or email account works for your organization. I'll also add the following text to the body of the email. A new official Denalix corporate policy has been published. I'll add a couple spaces for title and description, and I'll also add in here at the bottom, please click on the link below to open and read the new policy, and make sure you understand what impacts this new policy may have on you, your position, or your tasks. I'll include the title and description for the new policy so that users will know what the policy is about by pulling them in from the official corporate policy's item reference in the context browser. Then for the link to the policy document, drag and drop the hyperlink inline function from the context browser into the email body here at the end of the message, the same way we did in the previous message. In the Create Hyperlink Function configuration dialog box that pops up, configure the hyperlink to use the title of the document as the display name for the hyperlink, and then use the Link to Item field from the official corporate policy's item reference as shown on my screen here. Go ahead and click OK when you're finished. Now quickly save your workflow to back up all the changes you've made up to this point. Your workflow should look similar to mine on the screen now that we are at the end of step 6.5. In review of this step, we added the server tasks that K2 will perform if the policy is approved. These include copying the policy to the official policies library, sending an email to the requester to notify them that their policy was approved, and sending an email to everyone in the organization to notify them about the new policy. With that, the policy review workflow is done, and in the next step, we will take a moment to deploy it back to K2. With step 6.6, we're going to deploy the corporate policy submission workflow now that we have completed all the workflow steps it needs to operate. Let's take a moment to deploy this workflow now that it's ready to go. From the File menu at the top of your page, select the Deploy menu option that appears. The workflow will be validated at this point and will then be deployed to our K2 environment. This may take a bit of time to complete if this is the first time you're doing this in your system today. So at this point, I'll pause the video and come back when my workflow is deployed. Okay, when you see the success message, your workflow has been deployed to your system. We can select the Close and Exit button to go back to the K2 Application Elements screen. And then to set up for the next phase of the build guide, go ahead and click on the site title at the top of your page to return to the landing page for your site. In step 7, we will test the corporate policy submission workflow by submitting a new policy for approval, test the rework path, and then finally approve the new policy. We will break the test into several sub-steps as we did in previous steps. For step 7.1, we will upload the document and start the policy submission workflow. A couple quick notes to review before we start. Depending on how you configured the final email notification distribution in this workflow, you may want to go back and set it to send the new policy release message to only your account rather than everyone in your organization before running through this test phase. Also, make sure your assigned policy type approvers and reviewers are aware that they may receive an email message to review and approve your test policies as they come through. Take a moment to create a new sample corporate policy document. Make sure that the sample document makes it clear that this is a test policy just in case anyone mistakes it for a real policy in your environment. In my case, I've already created a document called samplepolicydocument.docx. Let's return to the corporate policy submissions library and upload our new document. When you're prompted to provide properties for the document, you can use whatever properties you like for the title, description, and type. Just remember that these values will be used by the workflow. Now I'm going to enter in sample policy test for the title. For description, I'll enter in this is a sample policy used for testing purposes. And finally, I'll use the HR type here. Again, be sure to let the policy type approver assigned to this type in your environment know that they should approve this new policy for testing purposes. Because the K2 service account running the workflow will need access to this document when the workflow runs, we'll need to check the document in before starting the corporate policy submission workflow. We can do this by clicking on the context menu for this document, select Check-in. We can leave the comments blank for now and just click OK. Let's move on and start the policy submission workflow. Again, click on the context menu option for this document, then select the K2 Workflows item from the menu. From the K2 Workflow page, go ahead and select, if it's not already there, Corporate Policy Submission Workflow from the drop-down list at the top here. Then click the Start button when you're ready. We can give it a few seconds to kick off, and then we'll refresh the library view from the browser. After refreshing the browser, notice we can see that the policy status column is now set to Submitted for Review. This works because we added the Update Document Properties workflow step at the beginning of the process, which was configured to write back information in this column, thus giving feedback to our users as the process runs. Let's use the K2 Workflows context menu option again, and we'll verify that the corporate policy submission workflow has started from a reporting point of view. We can see that there is a reported instance of the workflow currently running against the document under the Workflow History section right here. You want to know who's assigned to review the task for this process? We can use the View Flow link to find the names of those who need to review the document. I'll open that view up in my browser here. Then I'll select the Review New Policy icon here in the workflow graphic for the user task. If your environment is different than mine, make a note of one of these users if your own username does not appear, since you will need to ask this person to review the document as we move through the next steps to test this application. That's all we need to do for step 7.1, so to quickly review, in this step we uploaded the new corporate policy, set its properties, and submitted the policy for approval. The first user task for this application is that the policy needs to be reviewed, so let's complete those tasks next. In step 7.2, we will test out the rework path of the corporate policy submission workflow. Take a moment if you need to ask one of the reviewers identified in the previous step from the Participants tab in the workflow report to open their email application. Or you can open your own email client if you'd like, if you happen to be one of those approvers yourself. There should be an email message from K2 asking to review the submitted document. A quick mental note, the policy review tasks should also be available on the K2 work list when assigned reviewers open the SharePoint site landing page for this application. Once you have the email message open, click on the work item link in the email message, which should open the K2 form to work this assigned review task. Okay, great. Notice we have all the entered information for this policy document from the data source on this form, as well as a link to that document. Feel free to open the submitted policy document using the link on the form if you'd like. At this point, let's select the Return for Rework action and then submit the form back to K2. This is going to send a task back to the workflow originator and notify this person that he or she needs to fix the document before it can be sent on for approval by the policy type approver. Having done this, let's flip back to the Corporate Policy Submissions library to look at the document status column for this document. From our point of view, we can see that the policy status was set to Rework Required. Now, I'll go back to the landing page of my site to check the K2 work list. I want to verify that as the requester, I've received a task to rework the document and either resubmit it or cancel the submission. Looks like I do have an assigned rework task waiting here. In this case, I'll open the form up through the work list and I'll go ahead and resubmit the document for approval. If you'd like to in your own environment, feel free to take a moment here to check out the document, make some changes, and then check it back in before using the work item page to select the Return for Review action. Now, moving on, I'm going to open up a browser for one of the reviewers identified in the previous step. In my case, I'm going to open up Julie's browser to the Applications landing page. Then I'll open up her Review New Policy task from the K2 work list by clicking here, and then select the Send for Approval action on the task form to move it on to the policy type approver. Before moving on to the next step, I also want to jump back over to the Corporate Policy Submissions library and then open the K2 Workflows context menu option for the submitted policy. From here, I want to use the Workflow History and ViewFlow report to verify that the document is now waiting at the approval step of the workflow. And it looks like it is. I also want to use the Participants tab in the ViewFlow workflow to determine who needs to approve the policy. In my example, the user assigned to this task is Cody, since Cody is the approver for HR policies. That's the end of step 7.2, so let's quickly review what we just did. In this step, we tested that the rework path of the corporate policy submission workflow was working as expected. In the next step, we will test that the approval path is working as we want it to. In step 7.3, we will finish up our test of the corporate policy submission workflow by validating the approval path, and we'll also make sure the document is moved over to the official corporate policies library. Take a moment if you're in your own environment to ask the approvers for the new policy to open their emails and verify that they received the submitted policy as an attachment. In my example, I do have a browser opened up as Cody, and I've brought up her email client showing the message she has received asking her to approve this document. I'll go ahead and reply to the email with the approved action as the response. Now, after a few seconds, we should see a confirmation email message come back to this approver that the approval task has been completed. I'll pause the video here for a few seconds to preserve time. Great, you can see the response from K2 here as it appears in Cody's inbox, indicating that the policy document has been approved. Now let's browse over to the official corporate policies library and verify that our policy document was indeed moved to this library. It looks good. Let's also verify that the title, description, policy type, and approval date values were populated correctly. Those look pretty good here as they are matching up with what we entered in for this document at the beginning of our test. Also, notice that the history column has a link in it now. Let's click on this link for the policy in the approval history column and review the ViewFlow report. For audit purposes, we can check the Participants tabs for the Review New Policy step, and we can also check the Approve New Policy step. This will show us which approvers reviewed and approved the new policy. Let's quickly go back to our email client as the requester for this policy to verify that we received a notification that our submitted policy was approved. Okay, and the link in this email should also take us to the official corporate policies library. Great, and that looks like that works too. Lastly, let's go back and verify that the general notification email was sent to notify all users about the new policy by going back over to Cody's email view. There's the global message. Let's quickly check that the link in this email opens the approved policy document. And that looks good too. That's it for step 7.3. In this step, we tested that the approval path of the corporate policy submission workflow works. In the final step, step 8, we will test the corporate policy withdrawal workflow. In our final step, which is step 8, we will test the corporate policy withdrawal workflow by requesting that the new policy we just submitted is withdrawn from the official corporate policies library. Starting inside the official corporate policies library, let's open the context menu for the policy that was just approved. Then select K2 Workflows to open up the K2 Workflow related window for this specific document. We can go ahead and start the corporate policy withdrawal workflow now. Keep in mind again in your environment, ask the approver of the policy type to open their email to see if they have a message, and then reply to that task notification email with the action of Approve Withdrawal. I'll go ahead and do this as Cody in my environment by switching over to her email client again. Then I'll reply to the message here with Approve Withdrawal and send it off. Now, before we move on, let's wait for K2 to respond that it has received this message to complete the task for Cody. Okay, there's our message. Now let's return to the official corporate policies library and verify that the policy document has been deleted. Upon refreshing the library page, it looks like our policy has been removed from the library. We can also review the workflow history information about this remove process we just ran by looking at the K2 reports that we configured for this solution. You can open the K2 report page for this library from the K2 group of buttons in the Library tab at the top of the page. I'll go ahead and do that right now. Notice we have some instance information listed in the Workflows bar chart. You can click on that instance to populate the Workflow Instances report, and then open the ViewFlow report to review the workflow history for the corporate policy workflow instance that we're looking at. And that's all we have to do for step 8. In this step, we verified that the corporate policy withdrawal workflow was working as expected. This concludes the testing and build of your corporate policy management solution. If everything worked as expected, congratulations on completing this exercise. A quick reminder here, if you did change the final send email step of the submission workflow to send the notification only to yourself, remember to go back and edit the submission workflow, change the to email address for that last step, and then redeploy the workflow if you'd like to use this in your environment. This application demonstrated how you can leverage some of the capabilities of the K2 platform to create a policy management application that can really help your organization implement a robust corporate policy governance model. Of course, there are hundreds of other uses of the platform, and you will learn about these as you continue building K2 applications, but we hope you're starting to understand some of the real-world business benefits that K2 can bring to your organization. Feel free to modify the workflows, data, and forms in this sample application to meet your own organization's requirements. If you've run through the other K2 tutorials by now, you should be getting very familiar with how to use the various wizards in order to build K2 applications in your own environment.